Hello and welcome. I'm Eileen Fuchs, the President and Executive Director of the National Building Museum. Thank you for joining us for the next program in our timely new signature series, Climate ABC. The National Building Museum's mission is to educate and engage people about the built environment and its impact on our lives and our communities. As a primary driver of global warming, carbon emissions impact everything from the future of coastal cities to the record flooding that threatens communities across the country and around the world. The built environment is responsible for nearly 40% of carbon emissions worldwide, and the museum is committed to offering programs that educate and empower innovative and positive action on this topic. For over 4 decades, we've presented celebrated exhibitions and programs that have touched on everything from design and construction to social justice and equity issues. And we've been at the forefront of sustainability and resiliency topics, beginning with our 2003 exhibition, Big and Green, and continuing with our Smart Growth and the For the Greener Good series. This program is no exception. Climate ABC, which stands for Action, Building, Community, focuses on 3 essential aspects to addressing climate change: actions by individuals, businesses, nonprofits, policymakers, civic entities, examples of buildings, both physical structures and landscapes, and communities at every scale that are working to reduce carbon emissions. We are offering dynamic programs designed to both educate everyone about climate action and to drive for substantive solutions in the building industries to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But as we're going to hear today from thought leaders who represent public advocacy and education, sustainable design, and innovative building practices, there are ways forward to reduce our carbon emissions impact, especially when there is cooperation and collaboration between government, industry, community, and consumer stakeholders. I want to thank and recognize Holcim as the lead sponsor of Climate ABC and for providing the valuable support we needed to undertake this important work. And now it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator. Susan Piedmont-Palladino is an architect and director of Virginia Tech's Washington Alexandria Architecture Center. She is also a consultant curator with the National Building Museum and has notably curated Green Community in 2008 and our current exhibition, Justice is Beauty, the work of Mass Design Group. Please welcome Susan.
Thank you, Eileen. It's great to be here, wherever here is. Anyway, let's get started. We opened this series, Climate ABC, with a really expansive question in our program in November, which was, how do we reinvent cities? We heard from architects who are engaged in projects that are aiming to do just that. But we also came up with a lot of questions that came out of that discussion. And we learned more and more about how many voices, how many constituents are involved, and also how the aspiration to reinvent can run right into concerns about untested and unproven ideas and innovations. So we began to wonder, as we put this program together, who leads in innovation, who pulls, who pushes, what are those forces, what follows from those efforts, what about regulations, risk? And that's what we want to talk about tonight. We have with us a group of panelists who know something about these challenges and opportunities. And so I'm going to introduce them in order of appearance, and then we will roll right into their presentations. You can probably find more lengthy bios of these panelists on our website, so I'll be quite brief so we can get right to the task of discussing this. First, we have Josep Maset. Josep is the Vice President of Strategy and Commercial Excellence at Holcim US. And Holcim, if you are watching the slides introducing the show, is US and global leader in innovation and sustainable building solutions and one of our sponsors. Then we'll have Benjamin Fry. Ben is a project executive at Moriarty Associates, and he's been working in the construction industry since graduating from Drexel University in 2004. He's currently overseeing a student housing project in the district with American campus communities. And finally, we have Theresa Backhus. Theresa is the Associate Director for Outreach and Engagement for the Building Innovation Hub. And she is a registered landscape architect and Virginia Tech graduate. Go Hokies, had to put that in there. She has over 15 years of experience improving the performance of buildings, landscapes, and communities in the DC metro region. So Joseph, I'm going to turn the screen and the microphone over to you.
So hello, everyone. And thank you, Susan, again, and thank you, Eileen, and the museum for giving me the opportunity to be part of this conversation. Minimizing our environmental impact is everyone's responsibility. And the built environment has an essential role to play in our transition to a fully sustainable planet. With my time today, I want to make the case that there's a better way to build, a better way that takes sustainability to heart. As some of you might know, Holcim is the global leader in innovative and sustainable building solutions. Our goal is to enable greener cities, smarter infrastructure, while improving living standards. It's about the people, and it's about the planet. The picture you see in this cover slide is from a job we did in Bangkok, Thailand. It is the largest rooftop farm in Asia and uses our roofing green solutions. One of the interesting features of this green roof is that the different cascading farm levels form a detention lawn, which slows down water, stores rainwater while using it to grow food. I chose this picture because it shows a seamless interaction between nature, people, and the built environment. And that's what we need to achieve if we want to be truly sustainable. Before I make my case about why there's a better way to build, let's take a step back and look at the reality we're facing. There are three trends shaping our planet worth bringing up for this conversation. The first one is population growth. There will be 10 billion people in the planet by mid-century. That is 2 billion more than what we have today. The second has to do with the fact that people are more and more choosing to live in urban environments. We will continue to witness a growing urbanization. As a result of both, and to keep up with demand, we will need to build the equivalent of one New York City every month for the next 30 years. And all of this is happening in a context of increased demand for better living standards and more efficient infrastructure. So the built environment is definitely poised to continue expanding. With that said, we have to be mindful about how that growth is taking place. Why is that? Well, the impact of the built environment in global warming is sizable. The carbon emissions coming from our homes, our offices, our schools, make up 38% of the total global emissions. 1/3 of those are generated during construction, also referred as embodied carbon, but the bulk of it, 2/3, are generated during the life of the structure. We need to provide the infrastructure our society needs, but we must do it in a much more sustainable way. To do so, the built environment needs to be fully transformed. There's no silver bullet, but what I want to share with you is a few things we can do today that will move the needle. The first thing I want to suggest is that we need to build with less. This is about creating the structures and buildings our society needs, but to do so using less resources. We have new materials at our disposal. To make the point, I will use Holcim's ductile. This is a high performance material that, when compared to regular concrete, allows for 50% material reduction while providing much higher durability. You can also go modular, which generates less waste than the traditional constructive methods. An exciting development is 3D printing that can use up to 70% less material. The picture at the bottom shows Africa's largest 3D printed affordable housing project. It will be built this year in Kenya, and we're proud to participate side by side by other great partners of the museum, like the Mass Design Group. We should also build less often. And I will start by stating the obvious, but we should only build if we need to. But once said that, the next point I want to make is that we need to maximize the lifespan of our structures and buildings while minimizing any required maintenance. For instance, when designing a bridge deck, we can use material formulations that would make it last 75 years. But with the best technology, we can go up to 150, so double the life of that bridge. Let's talk roads. The usual choices are concrete and asphalt. For a low traffic area, you're fine with asphalt. On the contrary, for a congested road with heavy truck traffic, you might want to go concrete. Why? Because if you go asphalt, it will last 20 years. If you choose concrete, we're talking 75. Finally, let's talk resiliency. We want structures that can withstand the forces of nature. In other words, the environment should be a key consideration when choosing the design and which material to use. Let's consider an area prone to hurricanes. This is a picture of a town in the Florida coast after Hurricane Michael hit. The only structure standing were the ones made out of concrete. I'm definitely not advocating that we should always build with concrete. There is room for all materials, but location matters and should be taken into consideration. Let's talk building green, circular economy. Today, we have the 2.0 version of our traditional building materials. At Holcim, for instance, we have a range of low carbon concretes that perform as the traditional ones, but generate from 30% to 100% less CO2 emissions. Recycling, circularity is the key opportunity of our time. It is socially inclusive, it's climate friendly, and it's positive for nature. So it's important that we should build new from old. Some of the materials we're using today, like asphalt, concrete, are 100% recyclable. In the future, we want every new building to be made by at least 50% of an old one. And also, let's make sure we design with intent. We should always keep in mind what happens at the end of the building's life. Because recycling is good, but the construction is even better, as you need to do less processing of the old structure. The next idea I want to bring up has to do with restoring and repurposing. The basic premise for repurposing is finding a new use for an old structure. An example would be having shopping malls being transformed into warehouses. Today, we're doing it kind of after the fact, but with new buildings, we need to take that into consideration. In other words, design with flexibility in mind, so buildings can have more than one use. Restoring entails expanding the life of a structure. I will pick bridges as an example. We have 600,000 bridges across the country, and 42% of those are at least 50 years old, many of them getting close to the end of their life. There are proven technologies today to extend the life of our bridges with limited investment and impact. This is a picture of our ductile product being used to repair a structurally deficient bridge. In the right circumstances, this product can extend the life of a bridge by more than 50 years. Another example are new coating technologies available today that can stretch the life of a roof up to 30 years. Let's finally talk about building operations. For this discussion, let's focus on energy consumption mainly. As a starting point, we want to retrofit all buildings with new technology to make them more efficient. For new construction, we need to encourage smart designs that promote an earth-friendly lifestyle. A good practice is to make people aware of the energy they're consuming. These days, some apartment buildings clearly display how much energy each unit consumes. It's a great way to create awareness. Finally, I want to talk about insulation. Insulation is key. The right insulation has a significant impact in the building's energy efficiency. Depending on the structure, up to 60% of the energy can be lost through the roof. The experts in our Firestone Roofing division estimate that the difference between insulating to code versus using the best insulating materials could result in a 10% reduction of the building's energy consumption, which is significant. So I just went through some ideas that should help us move the needle. I now want to make some suggestions about how we could make it happen. The first element I want to bring up is collaboration. At Holcim, we believe that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's why we're thankful to collaborate with the National Building Museum today. And at the same time, we take pride of our multiple engagements with universities, like the MIT or the ETH in Switzerland, and to work together with like-minded companies in the private sector, from big name firms to the more than 100 startups we are partnering with. And I'm sharing what we're doing because we believe this should be the norm, or even better, this should be the minimum we should be doing. Collaborating and building on everyone's strengths and different perspectives is a key lever we have to use to its fullest. A key element I want to bring in next is to take a holistic approach. When we look at a complex topic like sustainability, we need to ensure we consider the whole picture. There's room for every material, but the best material for the application should be the chosen one. So how do we identify which one is best? It's simple. Let's look at the whole life cycle impact of the material in that application, from cradle to grave, including recycling. We should consider global warming, how recyclable is the material, total cost of ownership, and there is software out there that estimates that for you. At the same time, the information you need to feed those tools, the inputs, are becoming more commonplace. And I'm talking about EPDs, environmental product declarations. An EPD is like a nutrition label for sustainable properties. Lastly, let's talk innovation. It's about unleashing human ingenuity. Good news is that there's a lot of exciting things happening there. With our ever-expanding digital capabilities, we will only accelerate our progress. Sharing a couple of exciting innovations we're working on. First is our EcoPack range of low CO2 cements. And in the US today, one of our manufacturing sites is able to produce a cement that generates 60% less CO2 than regular cement. And to be clear, that is achieved without any carbon offsets. Also, earlier I was speaking about collaboration with startups. One of the promising technologies that came from those partnerships is a pavement that enables electric vehicles to recharge wirelessly while you're driving on top of it, which is really exciting. Last topic I want to bring up is progressive regulation. Public policy, regulations, and the government's buying power can reshape this space and unleash sustainability. The implementation of everything I've shared so far can be significantly accelerated if our government puts its weight behind it. 40% of the building materials used in the US are sourced by our government, federal, states, municipalities, counties. Our federal government is the single largest landowner, energy consumer, and employer in the nation. So as you would imagine, a change in their approach can really transform our industry. We're currently seeing progress and positive progress in multiple areas. Let me share a couple of ones happening at state level. Back in July of 21, Colorado passed a bill that gives procurement preference to low carbon construction materials in public projects. The state will establish limits on maximum global warming potential and drive for continuous reductions over time. We believe it's a great initiative, and it covers all materials commonly used in construction. Something promising is also happening in Oregon. They are looking to put in place a cap and trade program in 2022. At Holcim, we believe a US-wide price on carbon managed at federal level will serve us well. There's also positive activity at the federal level. I would highlight that this past December, President Biden signed an executive order requiring the federal government to neutralize its own greenhouse emissions from many areas, including buildings, and to do so by 2050. Buy Clean, as it is called, will encourage using construction materials made with fewer carbon emissions. The specifics are not yet finalized, but it's a promising step in the right direction. Let's talk about specifications. Specifications regulate how we build. They provide us with boundaries. Specifications define the sandbox where we can play. The issues that many of the standards we're using today are decades behind. It is understandable for structural engineers and agencies to be conservative. At the end of the day, they are the ones signing off, telling us what is being built is solid and that it will withstand the test of time. But material technology has evolved significantly. We're advocating for a more progressive approach. Don't dictate to the manufacturer how the material should be made, just define how the material should perform. Progressive regulation, properly vetted, would significantly unleash innovation and make construction greener. Today's prescriptive specifications are one of the key obstacles for a faster decarbonization. Finally, we would advocate to include sustainability requirements in those specifications. Oftentimes, the contractor only takes cost into consideration when deciding which materials to procure. We believe the environmental impact of any material should also be part of that conversation. Finally, we all know that it was the federal government that gave us the internet, LED lights, and the GPS. We believe our government can also play a very positive role if they were to support early research on sustainable topics. And we're seeing good initiatives in this area. The US Department of Energy just announced 2 weeks ago a $420 million funding for early stage research on clean energy technology and low carbon manufacturing. At Holcim, we're currently piloting 30 different carbon capture projects around the world and are happy to be working in one of those with the DOE. We also see good initiatives with state level agencies. To pick one, I will mention NYSERDA out of New York. This agency has always been very proactive to support green asset modernization. So we see exciting developments taking place. We would like to see an acceleration because the impact of those actions can be game-changing. So to wrap up, decisions have consequences, consequences that last for decades. The way we plan, the way we design, and the way we build will change our tomorrow. So we need to make low carbon construction a reality so nature and cities can thrive together. I hope I made a case that there is a path, but we have to make that path a priority. So let's take the challenge and let's build in a way that works for people and the planet. And with that, I'm going to hand it over back to Susan.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Decisions have consequences. I think we'll be talking about that more as we go through the evening. Benjamin, are you ready to queue up and share your screen with us, and we'll hear about your projects?
I am ready.
Okay, I will surrender the microphone to you.
So just a brief introduction again. My name is Benjamin Fry, project executive at John Moriarty and Associates of Virginia. Just want to thank Susan and the National Building Museum for having me on this panel to talk about some of the low carbon initiatives and things that we're seeing kind of in reality in place in and around DC and elsewhere. Again, I work for Moriarty and Associates. We're headquartered in Massachusetts. We've got offices in Connecticut, Florida, North Carolina, and here in DC, where most of my work has been taking place over the last 5 or so years. And obviously, the aspects of sustainable building and LEED has been an element in nearly every project that I've been a part of. So kind of what I wanted to talk on or speak about, just kind of build upon what Joseph's saying as far as how we get folks engaged is the combination of jurisdictions and clients and how the different communities that are behind the jurisdiction or a client or an institution can influence sustainable building practices. All right, so I put together a rough outline to kind of come up with, demonstrate a cycle of how community can influence a jurisdiction to create laws that become specification that make it into my world and construction. And similarly, how this happens with an institution or a client that's representing a population or a base or a community that, again, they can influence the design, specification, and construction to bring us more sustainable building practices and update LEED and get us and how they can be kind of driven that cycle. Sorry. and through making those design specifications a reality through construction. So real quickly, just kind of would briefly touch on the jurisdictional that have kind of seen success, as Joseph kind of touched on in California. National Resources Defense Council, there are incentives and for public work projects, and even in New York, they've started the Low Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, which is to get more and more of those projects to utilize low carbon concrete, to also pushing the utilization of performance-based specifications, which would allow alternatives such as Holcim's low carbon concrete mix, the EcoPack, to be submitted against traditional forms of concrete. And we're kind of get into that in my next part that I want to talk about that's specific to my current project. But locally, jurisdictional wise, we're seeing in Arlington County green incentive policies that are part of like bonus density initiatives. So whereas we're talking about things that are lead and that are requirements as far as what has to happen to get certain lead credits, some of these other incentives that are jurisdictional are really being advocated or kind of pushed into legislation by not necessarily making them a requirement, but by giving developers an opportunity to utilize a low carbon product such as the low carbon concrete in order to build onto their density in their population. So the case study I really wanted to talk about was the client-driven case study. My current project is a LEED Platinum project, which we're utilizing construction waste tracking, raw material sourcing, and environmental product declarations that we track. Obviously, these are the typical elements that we're utilizing to get to the LEED Platinum, and what are some of the things that we're doing above and beyond. So some of the current client that we're working with has other products that they want to utilize, as in bio-based materials, which we're utilizing the flooring products, which, to touch on kind of the challenges that when we talk about specifications, this is a simple enough specification that exists where we can go to a Shaw product that has been used again and again, and there's little more research is utilized, and we're able to use this this flooring product in this building. The next request from the client that we're currently working with was using low carbon concrete. So we've talked about kind of jurisdictions incentivizing its use, but it's not necessarily a requirement. And maybe there are other tried and true options to get density credit or another incentive for your jurisdiction. But when the client asks about using low carbon, it is something that, as far as us wanting to do what's in the best interest of the client, is something that we're going to tackle and do the research on, which is where Josep's company, Holcim, comes into play. So in this specific case, our low carbon concrete, there were no specifications that had the low carbon provisions. It wasn't a specification that included any sort of performance. It was your tried and true post-tension concrete that we see day in, day out. However, we had to set up an example of how we were going to test the strengths of this and come up with a game plan to convince the engineers and other ownership that low carbon was a viable option. So what did we do? We made our own case study. And what we set up was, between our team, Belfast Valley Concrete and Holcim, and our structural engineer, we decided to utilize the Holcim EcoPack mixes and all of the below grade concrete, which included foundations and pile caps and concrete elements. And with that, we took numerous field and lab cylinders. During that process, we used what's called the SureCure system, which is a probe that essentially monitors the temperature and environment that the foundation itself is being, like the temperature of the foundation is reacting to in the environment, and it replicates it in the cure box itself. So those cylinders and the foundation are basically identical. And then after that, we took enough cylinders to do breaks at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 days, which is what we needed to do in order to replicate the the sample size of what we would do on a PT deck to make sure that we were getting the breaks we needed at the time and the days that we needed them. So we made a lot of test cylinders. The amount of test cylinders we took in this particular project was twice as many as we normally would for a below grade foundation, which is really to replicate what we would typically do on a PT deck and then some. So once we had all the data, we plotted, and most importantly to our team was what we have circled here in the red area. What were our 2 and 3 day breaks? We had to get up to at least 3,000 PSI to stress the tendons within a 3 day window to meet our schedule. And so with this data, we basically presented a new submittal to the design team and asked them to review it against what their initial spec was and if this was something that we could do on the project and move forward with it. So it was a success. The data proved that the strengths obviously would come up within the 2 to 3 day window that we required from a schedule standpoint. And the structural engineer proved its use on all the post-tension decks. As you can see, this is the aggregate or Holcim trucks lined up down 8th Street on our typical pour day as we finish topping out on 8th Street. So when we talk about next steps and having a successful project like this one, we need to talk about creating more competition between the communities by pushing for going above and beyond like this client did. You know, we had a LEED Platinum goal, but we had a client whose community is focused on going above and beyond and doing more than the minimum. And so we have success stories like this, and how do we inform the public on that this took place. This is just another building in DC that's, was built with concrete, but this concrete is a low carbon concrete, and how do we get that out? And that kind of harkens back to my initial slide of the cycle, right? The more case studies that we have, the more that this gets publicized, the more folks know about it in the design world, the construction world, then the community can kind of push for that. So, that's what we're seeing. And that's kind of where I've come in to talk about projects that I'm not necessarily involved in Arlington, about the successes that we've had with low carbon on our particular project, and hopefully guiding some of the structural engineering and the future of other projects that it's a viable option. And this is just one case study of why this should be used in the future, and how we can kind of support that, whether it's with a client, institution, or if a client requires it for population density growth and getting a couple of credits, and we can offer that up as well, which gives that developer maybe a little bit more flexibility. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Thanks, Ben. It was fascinating. I hope some of my students are tuned in for this, because we've been talking concrete in studio. For the non-professionals in our audience, can you talk about, just while we're waiting for Theresa to queue up, all those wonderful concrete cylinders that you made? For people who aren't familiar with it, you're trying to smash those.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yeah.
So we do field cylinders, lab cylinders, and we try our hardest to replicate as much as we can what's happening in the field. So if something were to happen, instead of coring something, we've got that cylinder, and we took a lot of them.
Great, thank you. Okay, Theresa, are you ready to share?
Thanks, Susan, and thank you so much to Eileen and everybody at the National Building Museum for having me and the Building Innovation Hub this evening. We're really, really excited to be here to have a conversation, not only with my fellow panelists, but with you all about the role that you see, that we think, and that you see communities, industry, government, professionals, and private citizens playing in both affecting and addressing climate change, and of course the social impacts in our shared future that come along with that. So before I begin, I do want to take a minute to introduce the Building Innovation Hub. As Susan said earlier, I'm the associate director of the hub. We launched in October of 2020, so we're still relatively new. We launched with support from the District Department of Energy and the Environment, as well as our members. We were started specifically to support the building industry professionals, the private sector, the market, both create and operate better performing buildings, but our overarching goal is really to address climate change and help achieve not only the district's climate goals and green building priorities, but regional, national, and international targets. So even though the hub is operated independently of the District of Columbia, we are a nonprofit. We aim to fundamentally transform the definition of business as usual and make the district a model for sustainable market-based approaches to climate action. And we want to do that by both supporting those who are new to these concepts and principles, but also by encouraging market leaders to push harder and chart a path for others to follow. So we are very intentionally in this middle ground between the government and the private sector, both pushing and pulling, which I'll get to here in a little bit. So where are we headed as an industry, as a community, as a country, and as a world? I'll be tackling this topic from the perspective of buildings, because that's what we focus on here at the Institute for Market Transformation and the Building Innovation Hub. But really the principles and the concepts are much more broadly applicable than just buildings. I want to focus, why buildings? First and foremost, why buildings? As you can see here, it's a very large piece of the greenhouse gas emissions pie, right? The main driver of climate change is burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, which then produces these gases that trap heat, raise the temperature of the earth. And of these gases, CO2 is the main contributor causing climate change. So globally, this is the District of Columbia, but globally, buildings are the largest segment of energy consumers. And I believe it's around 40% of annual CO2 emissions are tied directly to buildings, to the construction of buildings, to the operation of buildings. And we all live, we work, we are in buildings for a majority of our life. So buildings are a huge, huge part of the problem, but they're also a huge part of the solution. It's even more pronounced in urban centers like the District of Columbia, where buildings make up a much larger relative percentage. Like you can see here in the District of Columbia, where we are based, and where the hub's focus is, it's not 40%, it's 71% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So this is why if we're going to address climate change globally, we need to do it locally by focusing on our buildings as one major piece of that strategy. Transportation and waste, the percentage of emissions is no joke either. However, you can see here that buildings really should be a place where we feel that we should start and focus our attention. As a point of illustration, here are some of DC's climate-related goals. So DC is an example of a replicable approach to addressing our climate crisis from a policy government perspective, but also from an industry perspective and a community perspective. So DC's goal has been for some time now to be the greenest, healthiest, most livable city with a focus on residents and people. So not just a sustainable city, a green city, but a sustainable green city that is healthy and livable. So DC is looking to accomplish this by addressing a number of issues, and one that's central to achieving all of them is this target to become carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2050. So essentially removing our dependence on fossil fuels. Given that we know that buildings are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions, we can't achieve this without addressing that building stock. So in order to, as Josep said earlier, we should really, ideally, in a perfect world, right, only build what we need to build. But we know that's not always practical. When we need to construct buildings, we have to do so to not only limit or reverse their effect on climate change, but to have positive impacts, societal impacts. So what does this look like on a nationwide scale? So speaking of that wider impact or that wider societal impact, here's a snapshot that we put together at the Institute for Market Transformation of some building related climate standards that are either currently in development or already exist across the country. And many of these are based on the district's approach that I just mentioned. I know this is a little small, but really the point here to take away is that action on a government level, on an industry level, on a community level is happening nationwide, which is encouraging, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And these in particular are related to measuring building energy usage and identifying opportunities for efficiencies as well as money savings. So they approach this by either requiring or incentivizing reductions in energy and carbon emissions. And as I said, there's a lot of work to be done. So, we're seeing a lot of activity on this front, and I expect to see a lot more of these dots. So the next 1, 5, and 10 years. So how do we influence that future progress over the next 1, 5, and 10 years? How can specifically the private sector, but also educational institutions, thought leaders, community members, private citizens, everyone balance all of these competing priorities in our lives and our businesses, society, to drive change in that positive direction? As both, I think, Josep and Ben said, it's about pushing and pulling. It's about collaborating and learning, and all of this at the same time. So it's give and it's take, and it's really using common goals and shared language. There's a lot of talking around each other, but so shared language is really important in this back and forth, this push and this pull. And there is always going to be competition for our time, right? Our energy, our money, but getting clear on our priorities must happen first before we begin to engage with others about how we can achieve these priorities. So there are various ways to do that depending on who you're engaging. And I'm excited to get into that during our panel discussion and our Q&A. When we talk about meeting our shared goals, is it more about pushing aspirational targets? Is it more about demanding change? Is it more about relying on an industry leader to pave the way? It's all of that, right? There's really two main ways, though, that transformation happens. It's through both regulatory changes and from market drivers, which have this push-pull effect on not just buildings, but materials, resilient neighborhoods, connected communities, and a strong support network. So you have regulation, which is pushing from the back or lifting from the bottom, if you will, establishing minimums and baselines. You also have market leaders, right, who are pulling from the front or pulling from the top and charting this path for others to follow and showing that these things really are possible. So it's not linear. It's not as linear as the diagram shows, because both the government and the industry send signals to one another. So the government is looking to market leaders to know what's possible and to really get a sense of how the market is moving, what the market can tolerate, and how it will respond to a regulation. And on the flip side, the market leaders are really looking to government to understand what their priorities are on a local level, national level, regional level, and where to position themselves accordingly in order to remain competitive and ahead. Let's talk a little bit about that bottom up, or that push. Regulation obviously is in place, as I said, to establish a minimum level of expectation. In DC, we're really lucky because our regulations, while they are a minimum level, are fairly advanced. And for example, as part of its climate and clean energy plan, the district adopted building energy performance standards. You might have heard the term BEPS, building energy performance standards. And those set a minimum level of energy performance for existing buildings. It's a policy that was the first of its kind in the nation. And a lot of those dots that you saw on that map were based on the district's BEPS benchmarking and BEPS regulations. The balance of, addressing energy use in new construction via codes and existing buildings via policy are some examples of how advanced regulations in DC can actively address different types of buildings in different points in their process. And eventually, by tracking that, the energy usage and the change through these regulations, we'll be able to see real tangible progress and put some numbers to this. So here you have the market leaders and community voices. And the market leaders are guided not solely by a mission, but by understanding that in order to remain competitive in a market, especially one like DC, you have to be taking a leadership role in addressing not just the environment, but occupants, surrounding communities, and embedding sustainability in business practices. like Josep and Ben were talking about. There's a lot of ways that businesses in the private sector can do that. You also have community voices that are leading the charge and pulling the industry and the government and the private sector towards more holistic, inclusive, and equitable directions. So these community members, community-based organizations, religious leaders are really movement drivers to help the industry and government hear more loudly and more clearly what is important, what is needed, and what cannot be ignored. So what is the hub's role? And really, this slide is also applicable to other private sector organizations, institutions, et cetera. But really the hub, and sort of this nonprofit role of these organizations that live in this kind of in-between space support the ambitions of both the government and the market, support the needs of the community, and really align with shared goals and common language. So, as jurisdictions across the country and across the globe set these ambitious climate objectives, resource hubs like ours are popping up all over to support markets. This past fall, actually in 2021, the hub was designated as an international center of excellence on high performing buildings by the UN. So we're really excited to be part of this global network of similar organizations to help translate what's happening, in very technical terms, translate those things into terms that everyone can understand, have access to information, to be able to make decisions, to connect with peers, and to really, provide the support needed to help implement some of this push and some of this pull. We've actively been supporting the launch of hubs in other cities as part of our partner, or I shouldn't say partner, our parent organization, IMT. We are also helping with technical resources, educational programs. So we kind of have our hands in a lot of things. So we really believe, though, that there's a role for everyone to play. That's the main point here. If you're a building industry professional, you should just do it. That's our, to borrow Nike's slogan, just do it. You should understand that. You should understand, I should say, what the role is of each discipline in a building's life cycle and beyond that in the industry, and make changes to your business practices as both Ben and Josep illustrated accordingly. If you're part of the general public, continue to demand it. Both the market and the government do respond to public pressure. So if you're not telling anyone this is what you want, how will anyone know? If you're in research or education, again, prioritize it, embed this into your work, ensure that everything you're working on contemplates impacts to climate change, or how your work will be used by the building industry to support climate action. And then for government folks, regulate, right? Support, incentivize it, understand where the market is and adjust accordingly. DC is at the leading edge of pushing this, but there's so much more that can be done, and there's an urgency for sure that we need to keep our pulse on. So what are some kind of examples? What's replicable? Here's some things we've found, and I'm not sure if this presentation will be sent around, but what I've done is I've linked specific examples in here for all of the points that I have on this slide. Really it's about partnerships. I mentioned DC Building Innovation, or the Building Energy Performance Standard. That's a very replicable model for local governments, but also for communities and industry that we are seeing around the country. Make things tangible, right? Tangible storytelling is, and thinking about the spaces that matter to you or the issues that matter to you, and communicating those in very tangible ways is powerful, and there are a lot of great successful examples, one of which is linked here. Make participation accessible. So we have a program, a utility integrated resource plan program at IMT, and they were able to pull together community members to create a set of public comments that would not have otherwise been sent to the utility, because it's so hard oftentimes to know when to plug in and how to access the people that are making the decisions. So, making participation accessible. If you're private industry, That looks different, obviously, than if you're in the government, but continue to think about how you can make information more accessible. I mentioned public-private partnerships, and that's a big one in driving decarbonization. I mentioned shared language and shared humanities. Community engagement and community-focused and just transition-focused design of policy is paramount. Community engagement and community needs cannot be an afterthought. They must be at the beginning and throughout the design of any program, any policy, in order to ensure that there is real, meaningful climate action happening. And rethink risk and reward. Like, I challenge you to flip the script on how you think of risk, or how you think of financial risk, or how you think of, reward when it comes to making decisions related to buildings in particular. So a good example would be the building energy performance standards. The avoidance of fines, the avoidance of penalties is a way of building into the development process risk avoidance. And then connecting data, emotions, and impact. That motivates the market. So connecting not only the emotional drivers, but the data around the impact that can happen as a result of this. So I want to give a quick shout out to our members, because we wouldn't be here without our members. And then here's my information, just in case you'd like to reach out. We're happy to hear from you. That's our job. So please reach out if you need anything, if you see any opportunities, or if you need any support related to buildings and policy. Thank you.
That was fascinating. I'm sort of scribbling notes as I'm listening to all three of you. And we have, of course, as we would expect from the Building Museum audience, incredibly knowledgeable audience members asking some, and I mean this in the best sense of the word, geeky questions, and also asking just some really fantastic kind of challenging questions. So we will get to those in a minute, but I want to sort of go through, get a little more in depth, if that's possible, because these were really dense presentations, about a few things, and toss a few questions to you. And let's keep talking about concrete for a little while. First of all, we heard the sort of dance between legislation and standards, if you want to think about what's mandated versus what's voluntary, the sort of carrot stick ideas, and the sense that maybe, Theresa, you talked about people are trading places in terms of who's leading and who's following, and the role that regulation and market driving plays in this. And Ben, I think it's interesting, buried in your discussion about concrete, which was really fascinating. Again, there's some people with very geeky questions for you, is this challenge that once this becomes, like you said, just another concrete building in the district, and that the structure is invisible, there's this really interesting question about what makes it stand out. And so we'll get to sort of unpacking some of those, but those are some of my takeaways from the initial presentation. So let's talk a little bit about concrete. And Josep, I want to go to you first, because Holcim has taken on this most ordinary, ubiquitous, and typically carbon-intensive material that most of people think of as, well, it's 100-year-old plus technology, reinforced concrete. It was like the sign of early modernism. And you're recasting it, pardon the pun, into something really innovative. So you talked about the ductile product. And I know a little more about that because the Building Museum did an exhibition called Liquid Stone quite a few years ago, and ductile concrete was one of the stars of that show because people were fascinated by how implausibly thin and expressionistic that could be. And so I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about this risk management and pushing the envelope and getting acceptance for something we think of as having to be massive and heavy, those cylinders that Ben's going to crush for everyone, and getting that product, and again, without revealing the secret sauce, what were some of the challenges of getting that to be accepted by regulations?
Susan, that's an excellent question. And to your earlier point, concrete is key in any sustainability conversation. Concrete is the second most used material on Earth after water. And definitely, we are reimagining how concrete is being used with our low CO2 products and we have enhanced its properties so we can build with less of it. And that's what Ductile is, and we have a few other products that can do that. And the important thing I want to emphasize about the beauties of concrete is that it's 100% recyclable. And that's where we need to get. We want to build new from old. And that's a great characteristic of concrete. On the specific questions about challenges of gaining acceptance for new products, well, I would say that those are real and are one of the key obstacles we need to overcome to decarbonize the built environment. The approach we follow, which takes a lot of time, but we are 100% transparent with all the characteristics of the product, and we share all the data that's required. Unfortunately, as I said, it's a complex process and slow that involves multiple stakeholders. And many of those are used to do things in a certain way that has worked well for them in the past. So there's some resistance to change, but we are seeing more and more DOTs and agencies open for new ideas. And look, construction has historically been very slow adapting change. And let me share kind of a quick point to tell the story. If you look at how much productivity has grown in the US over the last 20 years, that rate sits around 50%. Some sectors like IT have grown 350%. In contrast, the growth rate in construction over the same 20-year period has been 0. And that's not good. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them is that we need to be more progressive and really embrace the new constructive approaches available to us. To finish kind of on the positive side, if you think about it, the opportunities we have in front of us are massive.
Yeah, that's great. And to sort of, Dan, maybe you can pick up there talking about how the construction industry is traditionally conservative. The old, well, we've always done it this way. And if we've always done it this way and it's turned out pretty good, then why would we do something different? So you're involved in this innovative project right now. And you talked in your presentation showing us the specs and talking about what you had to do to convince the client to go with low carbon concrete. And a lot of it was insider talk. So maybe you talk a little bit, expand a little bit on that and explain it to people who might not understand. What's the specification? What are they typically asking for? And the decision to go back to them and say, this isn't good enough. You must have had client support for that. And so you wouldn't have just done that on your own, maybe?
No, I mean, so much of what we do is reactionary because we are client driven in so many aspects of what we do and trying to please the client and follow what they want. So you're right. The request that came up in this particular project was kind of late in the game. Specifications, which outline what strength the concrete needs to be for the different applications, whether it's the foundation or cast in place a slab on grade or the PT, the post-tension decks. So all aspects throughout the entire building are specified. And as I mentioned, it's the same spec that we see day in, day out. It's easy to bid. The concrete subcontractors are familiar with it. And as Josep mentioned in his presentation, the engineers are familiar with it and they're comfortable with it. They're not going to stick their neck out too far on something that is relatively new. And, just like you drive around the district and see all the concrete buildings and the concrete disappears, they're still standing. And those are all great examples of why you use that same spec. We run into this in construction day in, day out of convincing others of trying to do something in a way that maybe they haven't done before, right? Whether it's a skilled trades person that's been doing what they've been doing for years whether you're a younger project manager or superintendent trying to get something in the field done, you're going to hit resistance because what you do day in, day out is a repetitive process and becomes easier. But that's where clients like my current client come into play, right? They want to do something more. They want to push the envelope or they want to be on the cutting edge of this technology. And that's when you have to say, as somebody that's got to represent that client, let's take this example. And, we didn't know what we were going to find before we did the case study. But that's the exciting part for me anyway, let's do the case study. Let's work with folks like Belfast and Holcim and let's see whatever we need to do. And in this case where there aren't that many case studies in the United States of doing this, it makes it even that much more exciting to be, all right, let's be optimistic that it's going to work out. It is because Holcim has stand behind something that they've done internationally, but then to prove it locally and to win the support of structural designers and engineers that then can go to other jurisdictions where it's not just client driven, it's going to be maybe the legislation and that, kind of snowballs.
Yeah, and it's, this idea that once the building's clad and inhabited and it's dressed and the concrete disappears, this gets, I think, to Theresa's point about storytelling and a narrative. And the fact this, you could imagine putting up a sign saying you're entering a building with experimental concrete. So every step you take, and sort of trying to figure out how you tell that story. And so, Theresa, fantastic presentation. First, I have to congratulate you on the Building Innovation Hub receiving the 2021 AIADC's Partnership for the Planet Award. I think it's great, deserves mentioning, because it's really a validation of what the organization is doing, which is connecting ambition and action in the district. And of course, as you described, that puts your organization right in the middle of a triangle with design professionals, construction industry, regulation, all these stakeholders. That's kind of an interesting place to be. And so the view from there, you talked about who's pushing and pulling, that changes back and forth. Have you seen, you talked about the district as being kind of a unique jurisdiction. You want to expand a little bit more on that and how those roles of leadership rotate around in your experience?
Yeah. Being in this middle space it's very challenging, but it's also very exciting and it's very rewarding. And we're intentionally in that middle space to, pull levers, make connections, translate tricky subjects, and be behind the scenes too, kind of helping people make connections. I think it's sometimes the most frustrating, can be the most frustrating space to be in. But personally, I love being in the middle. And I think, this frustration with kind of, balancing all competing priorities and loud voices and low voices and giving everyone equal space and driving change built on consensus is frustrating. And that's what keeps a lot of folks away from this middle space. But I see it as, if it's frustrating, then we're making progress because we're having tough conversations. We're creating connections that typically might not talk or might not be involved as early as they should be. And that's really where sustained and lasting change happens. It happens in increments. It happens in connecting small actions together in a chain, that has a much larger impact. And it's staying flexible. So you talked about this push-pull changing and leadership changing, especially, in just practical terms, administration's changing every so number of years from a government perspective. And, companies constantly evolving to adapt to very real change. COVID is a great example, that threw everyone, threw everyone for a loop. And so there's this constantly evolving and constantly changing environment, literally and figuratively. And I think it's important to stay flexible, but it's also important to understand that we do have a lot of shared goals, that we might see, instead of immediately looking at the other as an adversary, there are a lot of shared goals and shared connections and that we might not realize we have. And so being in this middle space is very rewarding in that, when we make those connections and we see change happen, it usually sticks, even through changes in administration, even through, changes in the market. So I hope that answered your question, but happy to elaborate further.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I'm also intrigued a little bit. You were with USGBC, and I'm intrigued with, again, Josep sort of introduced this relationship between standards and legislation and how there can be a voluntary set of standards that people adopt, and then those things can migrate into becoming regulations, which I think is really interesting. But what's also interesting with certifications, and we have some questions about Passive House, and I'll get to the audience questions in a minute, about how those, and this might get to the investment side of this, and why a client like Benjamin's might be interested. Those badges or certifications begin to have currency in the marketplace. And to me, that's a really interesting story about how voluntary guidelines can develop currency and status and also become regulations. We don't usually think of building codes as having that. Just because you have 2 egress stairs doesn't mean you get anything out of that except resting more easily at night, knowing that your building is safe. But some of these standards are actually being marketed. And so I think that's really intriguing. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that. That's not really a question, but it's an opening for conversation. Ben or Joseph, anything?
Yeah, no, I kind of touched on it a little bit, just kind of, when you go LEED Platinum, you're already kind of at the top, right, of what's required, especially in DC, that's pushing the LEED building initiatives of green building and sustainable building. But for instance, our current client, it's really just them wanting to show again that they are doing something above and beyond, and they can go back to the folks that they're representing in their community and the campus and say, this is what we're doing. This is what sets us apart from our competitors, and it makes them, a little bit more attractive to be a part of what they're doing. And also to be, again, on the cutting edge. Maybe they push forward another innovation because they're pushing these things that aren't a requirement.
Yeah, and we'll stay on this for a minute because we have a question from the audience. We have a lot of questions from the audience. So I've got one screen over here, another one here, trying to keep up with them, which is great. And I want to honor our audience questions here. One of them, I'm just going to go straight to a really fascinating, obvious one, which gets at this question about investment and payback. Donald wants to know, why would anyone be against this? Right? Is it cheaper somehow for developers not to focus on sustainability? Have we really flipped the equation? How could you possibly be against this? Joseph.
I will take a stab at that. I think it's not necessarily more expensive. It's not. So the issue is not cost. The issue is a different approach, is a different way of doing things. And people are used to do things the old way because the old way worked in the past. So for me, the issue is that is not cost. It's difficult to embrace new things, but we will get there because there's a very strong case for it.
And that this is just better all around, which I think it's a great, obvious question. I love that question. Then we've got a few that are really geeky. And they're very important to a few people. And I think again, it shows how knowledgeable our audience is. And Joseph, thinking about regulation and the sort of hidden voices that are affecting legislation and regulation that aren't, again, always obvious. Jay is curious about the Buy Clean bill. And he says the concrete industry itself continues to keep concrete out of the California Buy Clean bill, if that's what the CA stands for, including the one that's in legislature now. And he's just curious about what's Holcim's position on keeping a large contributor to embodied carbon out of that law.
Yeah, so we have a broad reach in the US. We're in 45 states. We're not in California, so I don't know all the specifics of the bill, but I can answer his question. So let me be clear. So we support including concrete and cement in Buy Clean bills, and we've done it in the past. When these bills have been introduced recently in Colorado and New York, we were there supporting those bills because we believe that's the right thing to do. We believe there's a room for all materials, but the material you're going to use depends on the application. And you have to make the case looking at the whole life cycle assessment. And the best material should win. So we are totally in support of including ready-mix cement and all products in those Buy Clean bills.
Great. And we're going to stay on the concrete for a minute because, Ben, there was a question about, again, drilling down even to the more invisible part of reinforced concrete, which is the reinforcement. And we have someone in the audience who is curious about the position on using composite fiber or alternatives, polymers, as in the reinforcing instead of traditional rebar.
Mhm.
And if that's something, would that take another round of testing and approval and proving acceptance?
I don't know that it necessarily would. We do utilize coated rebar or different varieties of rebar, like they're mentioning the fiberglass in areas that might be sustainable to something that's corrosive, that might be harmful to steel that we're typically using as rebar. I think this might get more into the category of again, what is normally utilized. You know, has there been enough research done using it? So maybe to that point, but also cost probably comes into it, where the manufacturing processes for some of those rebar are still at a point that using traditional rebar is much more economical. And that's kind of a trade-off. Like sometimes if you're going to have to use something more economical like traditional rebar, maybe you're actually need to view it as you're saving that money to use towards something else that's maybe a LEED platinum or a bio-based material or something of that nature that checks more boxes than changing from steel to fiber.
So that, I mean, I think that's a great answer. So there's this sort of looking at the total issue, where are you kind of going to weigh the options of doing things more conventionally versus saying, here's my chance to try something else. So we're going to step away a little bit from the kind of geeky concrete questions. And we have someone from who's just curious, actually Susan, another Susan, who's curious about resources for homeowners. Maybe these aren't professional developers or people who are building large multi-story buildings. What are the best resources for homeowners to get started in going low carbon? She continued, while my house needs help, I found that your run-of-the-mill contractors who I come across don't know much about this. So Theresa, maybe we'll toss that to you in terms of thinking about communication and your list about all of the things we can do to change the conversation. What would you suggest to Susan?
Yeah, that is a great question. I am also in the same position that you're in, and with my house, I'm trying to practice what I preach, right? By electrifying as much as possible. You know, when my equipment reaches its end of life, switching off of gas appliances to electric appliances. I think that we have a lot of great resources on IMT's website, on the Hub's website. It's generally geared towards the industry, but there are a lot of information too on how that affects homes and homeowners and homes, and how you can take that information and kind of, scale it down, I would say, to, your own individual house. So I would start with some of the resources that we have on IMT.org. And buildinginnovationhub.org. We have some there. Also, there are some contractors, and I'm familiar with them in the DC area. I'm not sure where you're based, that are familiar with these topics. There aren't many right now, but I think, talking about it, asking the questions, saying, is this something you're familiar with? Is this something you're considering, folding into, or the type of work you're considering? Just starting the conversations is important. That we have those conversations on the individual level. But there, and I believe various local governments also might have some lists of contractors that are doing this type of work. So I would check with your local government. I'm also happy to send you the lists that I have, just from my own personal experience, but also the Building Innovation Hub's experience with contractors that are doing this type of work. Beyond that, I think the best first step is understanding your building, understanding your house as it stands now. Get an energy audit. Get a home energy audit, and not just where they, change light bulbs. They do a blower door test where they really find out, how your house is performing, because then the biggest places to start. You can also begin to price those things out. So if you can't start with, HVAC, you can chip away at it where it makes sense based on your budget.
It's great. It's amazing how fast time flies when we're talking about these fascinating things. And pretty soon, I'm going to conclude with a set of 3 questions that we're going to ask you. And you've been prepped for these, so it's not a surprise. But we have time for one in between that. And again, I apologize to the audience if we can't get to all your questions. I think Paul has mentioned that we'll try to get to all of them. And here's just personally from what you're doing. If you had to pick one innovation or one sustainable action that your company is doing, or I'd even say that you wish your company was doing, that really excites you, what would that one be? And Josep, do you have one? Something that is your favorite?
Yes. So a few of the things I've mentioned kind of during my presentation could be my favorites, but I would just go with a project that really caught my attention recently that my company is doing, and that's the Circular Explorer. It's a bit different from the built environment, but close to it. It's a recycling catamaran powered by 100% renewable energy that we built in collaboration with One Earth, One Ocean. And this Circular Explorer is, as we speak, sailing our oceans, recovering floating plastics every day. And those plastics are afterwards recycled into new applications. So my favorite might change tomorrow, but today I would pick this one.
That's a great one. Ben or Theresa, do you have one off the cuff you want to just toss out as a favorite before we get to our last questions? If not, I've got my own list of favorites, but it's not about me tonight, so I'll just keep those secret.
No, I just think from the construction standpoint, we're so reactionary, and for me, it's really the favorite ones are the ones that are kind of uncharted and getting to know more about something new. And just like this opportunity to learn about low carbon, there's going to be another thing to learn about and to hopefully teach others and to be a part of. So for me, from a reactionary industry that's reacting to a client or a jurisdictional need, that's kind of the exciting part for me. Those are my favorite parts, and they kind of are ever evolving.
So our big 3 questions, and again, we're going to collect these. So when we're done with the whole series, we've got these answers from everyone. So Theresa, I'm going to toss the first one to you. And we're probably we're running out of time. So then I'll just move on down. I know each of you has your own interest in these. I know that this is an interesting question that you want to talk about, the issues of how do we bring equity, inclusion, multiple voices into the conversation. So what do you see that needs to change in how we communicate to our communities? Are we listening to everyone? Are we listening to everyone that we need to get to decarbonization?
No, we're not. I think there is a perception, that we only need to communicate more to communities. I think, but the people most affected by climate change really are, already well aware of the challenges. So what we need to do is bring community voices into policy making as much as possible, as early as possible, into decision making from the get-go, so that the issues have a human face, so that we can design solutions that make sense not just for people and businesses who have historically benefited from them, but for businesses and communities and individuals that have not historically benefited from them. So if climate change were about education, we would have solved it all by now, right? To lower emissions from buildings, using buildings as an example, we need to understand what people are most concerned about and then explain how this is part of the solution. So it's true of all facets. So you can probably tell from the answer, no, I don't think we're listening to everyone we need to listen to. I think we need to flip this question on its head and move from we communicate to communities to we listen to communities, and then ultimately to we follow communities' lead.
So let's talk about sort of our insider communities of design, architect, urbanist, construction. And Josep, I'm going to give question number 2 to you. What do we need? How do we in this community change to get to carbon neutral? The question from the audience, isn't it obvious? Shouldn't we all be doing this? And how do we should we try to educate, to empower our industry and our communities to join the effort?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the way we see it, and I see it, sustainability needs to be front and center of everything we do. Urbanists, architects, and especially designers need to see that we need to do things differently. And that doesn't have to come with extra cost, because it doesn't come with extra cost. and we'll need to embrace new technologies and new approaches to construction. We have the means today to be more sustainable, significantly more sustainable. So let's make sure we have the right framework in place and we can make it a reality today. And education and communication are key elements. Government, private companies, universities, institutions like what we're doing today can help convey the message. And the more non-technical the message, the better it's going to be, because we want the average Joe to be able to relate to it, understand it. So we need to make it meaningful to them. Today, when someone wants to get a new driveway or replace their sidewalk, as they were making reference in the questions, the usual, on average, the individual would get this estimate, a quote from several contractors. And those estimates would include the cost and when is it going to happen. That's going to be the end of it. And we want those quotes to also include sustainability component, because we want the environmental impact to be part of the conversation and the decision. We want the contractor to talk about sustainability, but most importantly, we want the customer to ask for it. So again, the push and pull. And that's kind of our destination. And education and telling our story in a relatable way, I believe will get us there.
Ben, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's huge, the client-driven part of it, and the successes and the case studies and just the communication of these projects that are out there and the innovations that are available. And to Joseph's point, that some of this doesn't come as a premium. And if it's something that maybe it's not a requirement, but it's new, but you get an incentive out of it somehow. But even if it's not incentivized, like this is going to be the norm likely in the future. Why not be on the cutting edge of it now and start to utilize these changes, and it's such as low carbon concrete, and really just push for it. And because there's going to be the next thing is going to be the next thing. And once we get past these, and these are just part of our reality, we move on to what's the other sustainable practices that we can start to include, and cost doesn't become a factor.
Great. And our final question, and Theresa, you referred to this in your presentation, so I'm just going to give you a chance to put an exclamation point on it, which is one of the objectives of this conversation is demonstrating innovative and replicable solutions. And what about your work in these projects, what you're doing with Innovation Hub is transferable to other communities and cities? Should there be innovation hubs everywhere? And is this maybe a key to that triangle of actors that are going to help solve this problem?
Yeah, I really do think that there should be hubs in every city. A lot of what we do by design at the Building Innovation Hub is we make everything as transferable as possible. Obviously, it's specific to the regulations in our local market and in the District of Columbia, but written in a way that is easy or applicable to pretty much any jurisdiction, or can be modified, I guess you could say, to fit, the changes. A great example that I think really illustrates this is the Institute for Market Transformation, the parent organization of the Hub, is working very closely with the White House Council on Environmental Equality now as it moves forward with the National Building Performance Standards Coalition that the president announced on Friday. This is an example of how something that's been happening at the local level in cities across the country is beginning to scale up and transfer to a larger level and to a bigger scale, a wider scale. And I think, the more action happens on the local level, the more kind of groundswell there will be for larger nationwide, policies and actions. And all of that at the local level is really driven by the community. So, these things that we're talking about is definitely transferable, and we're seeing them being transferred, as we speak, and it's really exciting.
That's an incredibly exciting development to end on. And before I toss it back to Paul Kilmer to close the program, just was one of our audience also just put in the Q&A, just a thought experiment. What if all our buildings were LEED Platinum? What would that world look like? And I think we're in the business of imagination and then action. And so that's a great way, and really exciting news, Theresa, on the building performance issues. So Again, our hour and a half went too quickly. Paul Kilmer, I'm going to cede the microphone to you.
Thank you, Susan. My name is Paul Kilmer. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the National Building Museum. Thank you to Theresa, Ben, Joseph, and Susan for this thoughtful and important program. To our audience, this series of programs continues next month with a focus on the role that carbon plays in climate change. Other upcoming topics in the series will include regulatory and policy incentives needed to achieve climate goals, adaptive reuse, and the new Green Deal. We hope you can join us. I also want to emphasize that you are the C in community in this ABC series, and we we actually need your feedback. Did you learn something new? Do you feel more empowered to act? You'll receive a survey where you can share your valuable thoughts on this program, and I truly hope you'll take just a few minutes to complete it. Please note that this discussion was recorded and an edited version will be available and free to view on our website within 7 business days. Please don't hesitate to spread the word. And if you were unable to attend our first program, Reinventing Cities, please view that international panel discussion as well on our website, nbm.org. Thank you so much for joining us.